The blanket was all he had against the desert's bitter night chill. Yet there she lay, a stranger from a tribe his people whispered about with fear, her breath shallow as smoke. Yúdah didn't hesitate. The rough-spun wool left his shoulders and settled over her shivering form like a prayer. All night he kept vigil, the stars his witnesses as he hummed the songs his grandmother had taught him, medicine songs older than memory. By dawn's first golden fingers, color returned to her cheeks. Their eyes met across a divide of language and custom, two children alone in a harsh land. But what would become of them when their separate worlds discovered their forbidden friendship? Could a simple act of kindness bridge what generations of mistrust had severed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A morning sun cast long shadows across the Pueblo village as Yúdah helped his grandmother gather herbs from her small garden. His fingers worked nimbly among the plants, already knowing which leaves to pinch and which stems to avoid. At 7 years old, Yúdah understood things that even some adults in his village did not. Your hands remember what the plant's like, his grandmother said, her weathered face crinkling with approval. That is why you were named Yúdah. You carry light in your touch. He smiled, the juniper pendant around his neck catching the sunlight. Grandmother had carved it herself when he was born, shaped like a small flame. It was his most treasured possession. Will I be a medicine person like you someday? He asked, hoping as always for a definite answer. She chuckled, a sound like dry corn husks rustling. The path chooses the walker, little one, but your heart sees what others miss. That is a rare gift. From across the village came shouts and laughter. Boys his age were playing a hunting game, practice for the men they would become. Yúdah's father stood watching them, his tall frame straight, and proud as he instructed the children on proper spear technique. Yúdah's shoulders hunched slightly. Last week, he had refused to participate when they pretended to kill a wounded deer. His father's disappointment had been a heavy thing. Your father fears for you, grandmother said, reading his thoughts as she often did. He believes the world requires hardness to survive. Does it? Yúdah asked. Sometimes, she admitted. But water shapes stone not by striking it, but by persistence. There are many kinds of strength. Later, while the others napped through the hottest part of the day, Yúdah wandered to the edge of the village. A small lizard basked on a sun-warmed rock, its scales iridescent in the harsh light. Yúdah crouched, whispering to it in a language he hadn't been taught. Be careful of hawks, little brother. Your brightness might catch their eye. The lizard tilted its head as if listening before darting away under a creosote bush. Yúdah smiled. The animals usually understood him, even when people did not. His thoughts turned to the stories he'd overheard about the Apache people who lived in the mountains to the east. The men spoke of them with fear and anger. Raiders, they called them, thieves of horses and children. But when grandmother spoke of them, her voice carried something different, respect. They are survivors, she had told him once, when he asked why she didn't fear them like the others. Like us, they remember the old ways of living with the land, not against it. As sunset approached, Yúdah was sent to gather firewood. His father had given him a man's task, perhaps hoping it would harden his soft hands. As he worked at the village's edge, he heard his grandmother's voice calling him. She stood in the doorway of their home, beckoning. Come, I will teach you the water-calling chant before your father returns from the council. Her eyes held a strange urgency he hadn't seen before. Inside their cool, dark home, she sat him down and began to sing in a low, melodic tone. The words were ancient, some in a language older than their own. Yúdah listened intently, then joined her, their voices twining together like braided sweetgrass. Learn this well, she told him when they finished. Someday it may be important. Why? He asked Dot. She touched his juniper pendant. Some songs are like seeds. We plant them in memory, and only later do they grow into their purpose. That night, as stars pierced the vast desert sky, Yúdah dreamed of water hidden beneath stone, and of strange eyes watching him through firelight. He clutched his pendant in his sleep, unaware that tomorrow would change everything he knew about himself, and a world beyond his village. The Apache camp stirred with morning activity as tea slipped away from the women preparing breakfast. At 8 summers old, she was already known for her disappearing acts. Her small fingers clutched a painted leather medicine pouch, her mother's final gift before the fever took her 3 moons ago. "TG, where are you going?" her cousin Nita called after her. "To gather the red root. It only shows itself at sunrise," she answered without slowing. "Uncle will be angry if you go alone." T pretended not to hear. Her uncle, now leader of their band since her father's death in a raid 2 winters past, had little patience for her wanderings. But the plants wouldn't speak to her with others trampling about, scaring away the spirits with their loud voices. The medicine pouch bumped against her hip as she climbed the rocky slope above their camp. Inside were the sacred herbs her mother had collected, each with its own power, its own song. 2G had learned some of their uses before her mother joined the ancestors, but many secrets remained untaught. This was why she must find the red root. Her mother had spoken of its power to strengthen the lungs against the coughing sickness that had taken 3 children last winter. From her vantage point, 2 could see the sprawling desert below. Somewhere to the west lay the lands of the Pueblo people. Her uncle spoke of them with content, soft villagers who built permanent homes and grew predictable crops. But her mother had whispered different stories, of times long ago when the peoples traded and even celebrated certain seasons together. The drought had changed everything. 2 years of sparse rain had withered plants, driven game animals northward, and dried many of the smaller springs. The bands fought over the remaining water sources. Her uncle insisted they must raid a Pueblo village soon or face starvation. "We take what we need to survive," he had declared last night around the council fire, "as we have always done." But, too, remembered her mother's words, "When we take without giving back, we become less than human." A balance must be maintained. By midday, her medicine pouch bulged with carefully harvested plants. The red root had proven elusive, growing only in the shadow of a particular rock formation her mother had described. 2 pushed deeper into the borderlands, ignoring the growing heat and her diminishing water supply. The sun had passed its peak when dizziness first swept over her. 2 sat heavily on a stone, her vision swimming. She had been so focused on her search that she'd barely sipped from her water skin. Now thirst clawed at her throat, and the distant mountains seemed to waver like spirits in a vision dance. "I must return," she whispered to herself, but when she stood, the world tilted alarmingly. T forced herself forward, stumbling over the increasingly unfamiliar terrain. The borderlands between Apache and Pueblo territories were dangerous, no. One's land and everyone's at once. She no longer recognized her surroundings, the landmarks transformed by her fever-blurred vision as afternoon faded toward evening. She found herself beneath a gnarled scrub oak. Its twisted branches offered meager shade, but her legs would carry her no further. Her skin burned with fever, even as her body shivered. The medicine pouch, she must use the fever bark. With trembling fingers, she untied the leather strings, but the simple movement exhausted her remaining strength. "Mother," she whispered as darkness edged her vision, "guide my spirit if it is time to join you." A cool breeze stirred the oak's leaves, almost like a whispered response. As consciousness slipped away, T thought she heard footsteps approaching light and hesitant. Her last coherent thought was a prayer that it wasn't a coyote coming to claim her before her time. Yúdah had ventured farther than usual in his search for firewood. His father expected him to return with a full bundle, A man's contribution, he had called it. The boy's arms already ached from the weight of the branches he'd gathered, but pride kept him from turning back until his bundle matched what the older boys could carry. The scrub oak appeared like a sentinel on the ridge. Its twisted form offered a perfect place to rest before the journey home. As Yúdah approached, he noticed something crumpled at the base of the tree, a splash of color against the dusty earth dot. His heart jumped into his throat when he realized it was a person. A girl, not much older than himself, lay curled on her side. Her clothing was different, decorated with symbols he didn't recognize. With a jolt of fear, he realized she must be Apache. Stories of Apache raiders had frightened him since he was small. They'll steal children who wander too far, village elders warned. Yet this was no fearsome warrior, just a sick child whose labored breathing spoke of serious illness. Yúdah set down his firewood and crept closer. Her face glistened with sweat, despite the evening's growing chill. When he tentatively touched her forehead, her skin burned against his palm like sun-baked pottery. "Water," he whispered, unsure if she could hear him. He held his gourd to her cracked lips, supporting her head as his grandmother had shown him when tending the sick. She swallowed reflexively, a small whimper escaping her throat. Night was approaching, and with it the desert's bitter cold. Yúdah knew he should return to the village and bring help. But would they help an Apache child? He had overheard enough council meetings to doubt it, and by the time he returned, the cold might claim her. Without further hesitation, he untied his only blanket from around his shoulders. The rough-spun wool had been a gift from his grandmother, dyed with walnut husks to the color of the earth. He draped it gently over the girl's shivering form, tucking it around her as best he could. "I will stay," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him, "until morning comes." The stars emerged one by one as darkness claimed the land. Yúdah built a small fire, not daring to make it large enough to be seen from a distance. Girl's breathing remained shallow, but at least she no longer shivered quite so violently. A coyote called in the distance, answered by its pack. Yúdah shivered, now feeling the cold himself without his blanket. He fed another stick to the fire and began to hum softly, the water-calling chant his grandmother had taught him just the day before. The melody seemed to belong to this moment, though he couldn't have explained why. Hours passed. Occasionally, the girl stirred, and Yúdah would help her drink more water. Once, her eyes fluttered open, dark and confused, before closing again. He wondered what her name might be, and if she had a grandmother who taught her songs as well. The moon traced its path across the sky. Yúdah fought sleep, jerking awake whenever his head began to droop. He told the girl stories in a whispered voice, legends his grandmother had shared about the first people and how they learned to live in harmony with the desert. "The juniper gives its berries, but we must never take them all," he explained, touching the wooden pendant at his neck. "The deer gives its life, but we must honor its spirit with songs. Everything is an exchange, a balance." As the night deepened, Yúdah sensed a change. The girl's breathing became more regular, and her skin, when he dared to touch her forehead again, felt cooler. His chanting grew more confident, as if the ancient words themselves were medicine flowing from his lips into the still night air. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the distant mountains with pink and gold, exhaustion had settled into Yúdah's bones. But as dawn's first rays touched the girl's face, her eyes opened clear and alert and met his own. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two children from worlds apart, meeting in the no-man's land, between their peoples. Chi tensed beneath the unfamiliar blanket, her eyes darting around to assess where she was and whether she faced danger. Yúdah raised his empty palms in a gesture of peace. "I won't hurt you," he said, though he knew she probably couldn't understand his words. T pushed herself up to sitting position, wincing slightly. The blanket pooled around her waist as she took in the small fire, the water gourd, and the exhausted boy with kind eyes who had clearly watched over her through the night. Water? Yúdah offered, holding out the gourd. To his surprise, she nodded. Tea, she said, pointing to the gourd. Tea, he repeated. In my language, we say ko. He touched the gourd again. Ko. A faint smile touched her lips. Ko, she echoed. This simple exchange seemed to break a barrier between them. Tu reached for her medicine pouch, which had fallen beside her, and withdrew a small handful of bark. She mimicked crushing it and pointed to the water. Yúdah nodded in understanding. He took a small clay bowl from his gathering sack and helped her prepare the medicine. As they worked side by side, he pointed to himself. Yúdah, he said. Yúdah, she repeated carefully. Then she touched her own chest. Tchi, he said, the foreign sound awkward on his tongue. She smiled more fully now, pointing to the sky where the rising sun cast golden light across the landscape. Dawn, she said in her language. Yúdah nodded enthusiastically. Yes, we call it dia. As Chi drank her medicine, color returned to her cheeks. She gestured to the blanket wrapped around her, and then to Yúdah, her expression questioning. He nodded. For you, he said, miming the act of giving. Her eyes widened slightly, understanding the significance of such a gift in the desert. She touched the medicine pouch at her side, then carefully removed a small polished stone from it. She held it out to him. For you, she said in his language, the words careful and precise. Yúdah accepted the stone with a solemn nod. It was smooth and cool against his palm, with veins of color running through it like frozen lightning. He tucked it carefully into his own pouch. The sun climbed higher. Both children knew they should return to their people, yet neither moved to leave. There was something unfinished between them, something important that transcended their limited ability to communicate. Yúdah thought of his grandmother's words about different kinds of strength, about water shaping stone through persistence. An idea formed in his mind, childish perhaps, but no less powerful for its innocence. He held out his hand, palm up, to Tia. Friends? He asked. She looked at his outstretched hand, understanding his meaning, if not the exact word. Then, with deliberate care, she placed her palm against his. Friends, she agreed, the word new on her tongue. Yúdah felt a surge of joy, unlike anything he'd experienced before. In that moment, with the dawn washing the land in new light, he made a solemn request in the way of his people. By the witness of the rising sun, he said formally, though she couldn't understand all his words, I ask to join hands in friendship, to walk the same path when we can. Pei seemed to sense the ceremony in his tone. She straightened her shoulders and responded in her own language, equally formal words that sounded to Yúdah like a song. When she finished, they both looked to the sun, now fully risen above the eastern mountains. A silent pact had been sealed between them, as ancient and true as the land itself. I must go, Yúdah said regretfully, gesturing toward his village's direction. Nodded, pointing toward her own home in the mountains. She gathered her medicine pouch, then paused, touching the blanket around her shoulders. Keep it, Yúdah insisted, miming again. She held his gaze, then nodded once more. With surprising grace for one so recently ill, she rose to her feet. Before turning to leave, she pointed to the scrub oak that had sheltered them. 7 sons, she said, holding up 7 fingers. Return? Yúdah understood immediately. He nodded, eagerly, also holding up 7 fingers. 7 sons. I will come. Yúdah's return to the village was met with a mixture of relief and anger. His father stood at the edge of the pueblo, arms crossed, face set in stern lines that deepened when he saw his sons approach, without firewood and without his blanket. "Where have you been?" The question cracked like lightning across the morning quiet. "Your grandmother did not sleep, thinking you were taken by coyotes or worse." Yúdah lowered his eyes. "I fell asleep gathering wood, Father. I'm sorry." "And your blanket? The one your grandmother spent weeks weaving for you?" The lie came quickly, surprising even Yúdah with its ease. "I was climbing the tall oak for better branches. It caught on a limb and tore. I was ashamed to bring it back ruined." His father's disappointment was a tangible thing, hanging between them like smoke. "You are becoming a man, Yúdah. A man does not lose what is precious through carelessness." Inside, their home, his grandmother waited. Unlike his father, she studied Yúdah's face with quiet intensity, saying nothing about his absence or the missing blanket. Instead, she placed a storyteller doll into his hands, a seated figure with 5 small children clinging to its base. "All things have stories," she said softly. "Even the things we think we've lost." Something in her tone made Yúdah wonder if she somehow knew what had really happened. But she asked no questions, and he offered no confessions. Miles away in the Maliao, Apache camp nestled among pinyon pines, Ta faced a different welcome. When she walked into the circle of hide-covered shelters, her cousin Nita was the first to spot her. "T, she's back." The cry brought others running, including her stern-faced uncle. "Where did you go?" he demanded, relief barely softening. His words, "2 hunters searched half the day for you." T.G. clutched her medicine pouch. "I was gathering plants and became ill with fever. I rested under a tree until I was strong enough to return." Her uncle's eyes narrowed at the unfamiliar blanket around her shoulders. "And this? Where did you get a Pueblo blanket?" "I found it caught in branches," she said. "It must have blown far in the wind." The explanation seemed to satisfy him, though he added gruffly, "The Pueblo villagers grow careless with their possessions, not like us." That evening, both children found themselves amid community discussions where their secret knowledge weighed heavily in the odd. Pueblo Kiva, men gathered to discuss recent Apache movements. "Scouts have seen them ranging closer to our hunting grounds," an elder reported. "They grow desperate with the drought." "They've raided the eastern settlement," said another. "Took food stores and a water barrel." Yúdah, sitting quietly beside. His father, as was expected of sons learning to be men, felt a strange twist in his chest. These raiders they spoke of with such fear couldn't possibly include the girl with gentle hands who had shared her medicine knowledge. "Perhaps they are just hungry," he suggested softly. "Like us." The silence that followed was broken by uncomfortable laughter. His father's hand gripped his shoulder in warning. "The Apache understand only strength," an elder said finally. "They respect only what they fear." In the Apache camp, a similar council was underway. T.G. sat with the women, grinding mesquite beans into meal, but her ears caught her uncle's words. "The Pueblo villages have water still," he was saying. "Their wells run deeper than ours. We must consider raiding the western settlement before our children grow too weak." "My mother said the western Pueblo once traded with our grandmothers," T.G. said suddenly. The grinding stones fell silent. As women turned to look at her, her uncle frowned. That was before they allied with the white eyes. Before they forgot the old ways of respect between peoples. Tichu thought of Yúdah, how he had given his only blanket to a stranger. "Perhaps not all have forgotten," she said. That night, in beds separated by miles of desert, both children counted days until their promised meeting, each wondering if their 2 worlds could ever truly understand one another. The 7 days passed with agonizing slowness for both children. Yúdah found himself counting sunrises, his thoughts constantly drifting to the scrub oak and the girl who had spoken his language with such careful attention. T, meanwhile, grew stronger each day, using the healing knowledge from her mother alongside the methods she had glimpsed in Yúdah's care. On the 7th morning, Yúdah approached his grandmother as she ground corn into meal. "I wish to gather herbs today," he said, trying to sound casual. "The ones with yellow flowers that you use for stomach pain." His grandmother's hands never paused in their rhythmic movement. "Those grow best near the boundary stones, far for a boy alone." "I'm almost 8 summers," he reminded her, "and you've taught me to know the safe paths." She studied him thoughtfully. "Take water and return before the sun begins its descent. Your father worries more than he shows." With her blessing secured, Yúdah carefully packed a small sack with vinga, cornmeal cakes, and dried fruit. As an afterthought, he added a handful of blue corn seeds, a peace offering, a sign of trust. In the Apache camp, the P faced a greater challenge. Her uncle had ordered everyone to remain close after reports of strangers near their hunting grounds. She waited until he left with the hunting party before approaching her aunt. "I must gather the red root today," she explained. "It only shows itself every 7th day, and my mother taught me its power against fever." Her aunt frowned. "Your uncle said." "My mother was the medicine woman before she walked the spirit path," Tegai interrupted gently. "Would she want us to forget her teachings because of fear?" The older woman's resistance crumbled. "Take Nida with you. The plant spirits speak only in solitude," Tia countered. "I will be careful, aunt. I promise by my mother's spirit." Reluctantly, her aunt agreed, and Tay slipped away, the Pueblo blanket folded small and hidden in her medicine pouch. The scrub oak stood as it had before, twisted limbs reaching toward the cloudless sky. Yúdah arrived first, his heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. What if she didn't come? What if someone had followed her? What if this fragile connection, this secret friendship, was just a dream born of that strange night? A small movement in the scrubland caught his eye. Teehee emerged from behind a boulder, her approach cautious, but her face breaking into a smile when she saw him waiting. She wore the blanket around her shoulders, despite the day's warmth, and the sight filled Yúdah with unexpected joy. They met beneath the oak's meager shade, both suddenly shy after the intensity of their first encounter. Yúdah offered the cornmeal, cakes, and TG produced a handful of pinnon nuts from her pouch. They sat cross-legged, facing each other, sharing this simple meal as if it were a sacred ceremony. "Yúdah," she said, pointing to him. He responded, pointing to her. From these simple beginnings, a language emerged between them, part Pueblo, part Apache, part invented signs and gestures. Two learned that Yúdah meant he who carries light in his people's tongue. She explained that her name meant she who withers, because she had been sickly as a baby, though her mother always insisted she would grow strong. "Like a desert plant," Yúdah said, mimicking something small growing larger. "They look dead in dry times, but come alive with rain." She smiled at the comparison. She reached into her pouch and withdrew a small bundle of feathers, one from a blue jay, one from a desert quail, and one from a red-tailed hawk. "For strength," she explained haltingly in his language. "For wisdom." She pointed to each feather in turn. "For seeing far." Yúdah accepted the gift with proper solemnity and offered his blue corn seeds. "For growing new things," he said. As the sun arced across the sky, they shared stories of their lives. Yúdah's grandmother's wisdom, TG's memories of her mother. They spoke of the drought affecting both their peoples, though neither fully understood its severity. "Water grows scarce," Tua said, gesturing to the dry stream visible in the distance. "My village's well still flows," Yúdah replied, "but the elders worry." Before they parted, they made another promise. 14 days this time. They would each bring something important to share. something to build a bridge between their worlds. 14 sons, T confirmed, holding up her fingers twice. Neither noticed the hunter from Yúdah's village, who paused on a distant ridge, narrowing his eyes at the unlikely sight of a Pueblo boy and an Apache girl sitting together beneath an ancient oak. The hunter, Makia, returned to the village with more than rabbits in his carrying pouch. His news traveled quickly from the hunters' circle to the elders' council. By nightfall, when Yúdah sat with his family around their cooking fire, the weight of unspoken questions hung in the air. "A strange thing happened today," his father finally said, studying Yúdah's face in the flickering light. "Makia says he saw a child speaking with an Apache girl near the boundary stones." Yúdah kept his eyes on the corn cake in his hands, willing his face to remain calm. "Perhaps he saw a deer. They stand on 2 legs sometimes. He says the child wore a shirt like yours." "Many boys have shirts like mine," Yúdah countered, his voice steadier than he felt. His grandmother's weathered hand came to rest on his shoulder. "Many eyes see many things in the desert heat," she said. "Sometimes they see what they fear most." His father frowned, but said nothing more. Later, as Yúdah helped his grandmother sort dried herbs, she spoke softly, without looking at him. "The boundaries between peoples are like canyon walls, Yúdah. They took generations to form, and cannot be crossed without great care." "Do you think the Apache are evil, grandmother?" he asked. She was silent for a long moment. "I think they are. People like us, with hunger and fear and love, like us." She selected a bundle of sage, adding, "But not everyone remembers this truth." The next morning, Yúdah's father found a broken arrow near their garden plot. The red and black markings on the shaft identified it clearly as Apache. The village buzzed with renewed fear. "They scout our defenses," one man insisted. "Preparing to raid," agreed another. The council decided to send patrols to guard the village perimeter, especially near the boundary stones and the scrub oak where Makia had seen the children. Yúdah listened with growing dread, knowing that his path to meet Tin would now be watched. In the Apache camp, different but parallel concerns were emerging. Tizi's uncle returned from a hunting expedition with troubling news. "Pueblo. Men walk the borderlands with weapons," he announced to the gathered band. "They prepare to expand their territory while we grow weak from thirst." T looked up from where she sorted herbs with the women. "Perhaps they only protect what they have, uncle." "As we do." Her uncle's gaze sharpened. "You defend them?" "Why? I speak only of what my mother taught, that fear makes enemies where none exist." "Your mother was wise in healing, not in war," he replied. "The drought grows worse. The game moves north. Soon we must choose between raiding or starving." That night, as the camp prepared for sleep, T's cousin Nida whispered, "Where did you really go 7 days ago? You brought back no red root." Two turned away. "Some medicines must grow inside you before they can be shared." "You speak in riddles like your mother," Nida complained. "Uncle says you wander too far. He says you will be watched now." Anxiety twisted in T's chest. 7 more days until she was to meet Yúdah again, but now both children would face increased scrutiny. The thought of never seeing her friend again, of their fragile bridge collapsing before it was fully built, filled her with a sadness beyond her years. Morning brought no relief. Her uncle gathered the young men, speaking of a planned raid on a small Pueblo settlement, not Yúdah's village, but close enough to send a message. They would take stored corn and whatever water they could carry. "When?" someone asked. 3 days, her uncle replied. "When the moon is dark." She felt cold, despite the warm air. 3 days. Not enough time to warn Yúdah at their planned meeting. Not enough time to prevent violence that would only deepen the divide between their peoples. That night, unable to sleep, Ty made a decision. She would need to find Yúdah before the raid. She would need to cross the boundaries alone, in darkness, with only the stars to guide her path. The crescent moon offered little light as T slipped from her sleeping mat. Her cousin Nita stirred briefly, but didn't wake. With practiced silence, T.G. gathered her medicine pouch and the Pueblo blanket, then eased past the hide-covered doorway into the night. The sentries were positioned mainly to the south, where the Pueblo lands lay closest. T moved west, keeping low among the rocks, using skills her father had taught her before his death. The night belonged to spirits and hunters, he'd said, and sometimes to brave children with important missions. Stars wheeled overhead, familiar patterns guiding her steps. She'd once scratched these same constellations onto a piece of bark, learning their stories from her mother. Tonight, they were her only map as she ventured farther from home than she had ever gone alone. The journey was longer and more difficult than she'd anticipated. Twice she froze as nocturnal predators crossed her path, a bobcat on silent paws, later a rattlesnake sensing her warmth in the cool night. By the time the land began sloping toward Pueblo territory, the eastern sky showed hints of approaching dawn. T had only a vague idea where Yúdah's village might be. They had pointed in directions when they spoke of home, but distance is hard to convey with gestures alone. She followed a dry creek bed, reasoning that people settled near water, even water that no longer flowed year-round. The first sign of human presence was a field of corn, the plants stunted from lack of rain, but carefully tended. T.G. skirted its edge, moving cautiously now. Getting closer to the village was dangerous, but how else could she find Yúdah? A sound made her drop to the ground, voices speaking the Pueblo language, men on patrol. She pressed herself into the shadow of a boulder, scarcely breathing as footsteps passed within arm's reach. When silence returned, she changed direction, circling away from the voices toward a stand of cottonwoods that likely marked a well or spring. Dawn was breaking when disaster nearly struck. Emerging from behind a juniper, two came face to face with a Pueblo boy fetching water. They stared at each other, equally startled, before the boy opened his mouth to shout. T acted on instinct, clapping her hand over his mouth and whispering the only Pueblo word she knew would matter. Yúdah. The boy's eyes widened. He nodded slightly, and T carefully removed her hand. You know Yúdah? She asked, in her own language, adding his name again for clarity. The boy nodded once more, then pointed toward a path leading away from the village. He held up 5 fingers and mimicked walking. 5 minutes? 5 directions? T wasn't sure, but she nodded gratefully and followed where he'd pointed. The path led to a small clearing where, incredibly, Yúdah himself was gathering early morning herbs. He looked up, his face transforming from concentration to astonishment. T, he whispered, rushing to her. How are you here? Why? She grasped his hands, her words tumbling out in their shared hybrid language. Danger. Men from my band plan to raid a Pueblo place. Not your home, she gestured to clarify, but nearby. 3 sleeps from now. No moon night. Yúdah's face paled. The South Village? Where my father's brother lives. T couldn't be sure, but the anguish in his eyes was answer enough. They will take food, water. My uncle says we must survive. There must be another way, Yúdah insisted. Fighting brings more fighting. I know. That's why I came. She squeezed his hands. What can we do? Yúdah thought for a long moment. We must tell the elders. Fear flashed across Dee's face. They will know I betrayed my people. My grandmother will understand, Yúdah insisted. She speaks of the old ways, when Apache and Pueblo shared water in dry times. A noise from the direction of the village made both children tense. Someone was coming down the path. You must hide, Yúdah urged, pointing to a dense thicket. No, T said with sudden resolve. No more hiding. If we believe in friendship between our peoples, we must stand together. In the light, as footsteps approached, The children stood side by side, their small shadows merging in the early morning sun. Yúdah reached for Tija's hand, and she took it without hesitation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. It was Yúdah's grandmother who emerged from the path, her aged form moving with surprising grace among the morning shadows. She stopped abruptly at the sight before her, her grandson hand in hand with an Apache girl, both children standing with the resolute dignity of those prepared to accept consequences. No surprise registered on the old woman's weathered face. Instead, she studied them with eyes that had witnessed nearly 8 decades of desert seasons. "So," she said finally, "the whispers were true." Yúdah stepped forward slightly. "Grandmother, DG came to warn us. Her people plan to raid the southern village when the moon is dark, 3 nights from now." The old woman's gaze shifted to T. "You betray your own to help strangers?" T, understanding the tone if not all the words, lifted her chin. "I betray no one," she replied in her own language. "I try to save everyone." Though she couldn't understand the Apache words, Yúdah's grandmother nodded slowly. "The drought has made us all afraid," she said, switching to a much older language, one that predated the divisions between their peoples. To Yúdah's astonishment, T recognized some of the ancient words. She responded haltingly in the same tongue, her mother having taught her fragments of the old language as part of her healer's training. "We must speak with the council," the old woman decided, returning to Pueblo speech. "But first, child, you must eat and rest. Your journey was brave and long." They followed the grandmother back toward the village, tension growing in Yúdah's chest with every step. "What about my father? The others?" "Truth has its own power," his grandmother replied, "but not everyone is ready to hear it." They entered the village through a back path, avoiding the main plaza. Still, whispers followed their progress. An Apache child walking openly among them was unprecedented. Some reached for weapons. Others pulled their own children inside doorways. In the grandmother's dwelling, she fed TG corn cakes and dried berries while sending Yúdah to fetch water. When he returned, his father stood in the doorway, face dark with anger and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, staring at Tia. The grandmother rose to her full height, her authority suddenly apparent despite her small stature. "This child came through darkness to warn us of danger. While you and the council argue about patrols, she crossed boundaries to prevent bloodshed." "She is Apache," Yúdah's father stated flatly. "She is a child," the grandmother countered, "like your son, both seeing with clearer eyes than we do." What followed was a day unlike any in the village's recent memory. The elders gathered reluctantly, allowing TG to speak through Yúdah's grandmother, who translated her warning. Some dismissed it as trickery. Others advocated holding the girl hostage to prevent the raid. A few, the oldest among them, listened thoughtfully. "In my youth," said one white-haired man, "Apache and Pueblo traded medicines when sickness came. Perhaps we have forgotten too much." Meanwhile, in the Apache camp, Tethys' absence had been discovered. Search parties combed the nearby hills, fear growing as the day progressed. "She has been taken by Pueblo hunters," her uncle declared, grief and rage mingling in his voice. "This decides the matter. We raid tonight, not in 3 days. But what if she wandered off again? What if she is simply lost?" Nita asked, thinking of her cousin's recent mysterious behavior. "No Apache child wanders toward Pueblo lands by accident," her uncle replied grimly. As sunset approached, Yúdah's father made his decision. "The girl must return to her people with our message. We know of their plan and are prepared. There will be no easy raid." "I will take her," Yúdah volunteered, earning a sharp look from his father. "You have done enough," his father said, reaching for a switch from the corner, a tool of discipline that had rarely been used on Yúdah before. You will remain here and consider the consequences of keeping secrets that endanger our entire village. Yúdah's eyes met TG's across the room. In that moment, both children recognized that their simple friendship had unleashed forces beyond their control, currents that had been building long before they met beneath the scrub oak. The switch never fell. As Yúdah's father raised his hand, the grandmother stepped between them. "Enough," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "The children sleep now. Decisions come with the dawn." Reluctantly, his father lowered the switch. "He will be watched through the night," he insisted before leaving. Despite the day's exhaustion, sleep eluded Yúdah. His mind raced with fears. For Tu, for his father's brother in the southern village, for the fragile peace that seemed to be crumbling around them. Beside him on a pallet of woven reeds, T slept fitfully, murmuring words in her own language not near midnight. His grandmother placed a dream catcher above their sleeping mats, a hoop of willow wrapped with sinew and adorned with sacred beads, to catch messages from the ancestors, she explained, though Yúdah was familiar with the object. Sometimes they speak most clearly when our own thoughts grow quiet. Eventually, Yúdah drifted into an uneasy slumber. The dream came suddenly. Vivid as sunrise. He stood atop a mesa he had never seen, though it felt eerily familiar. Below stretched a vast landscape, Pueblo lands to one side, Apache territory to the other, and in between, a valley he had never noticed before. At its center stood an unusual rock formation. 3 boulders balanced atop one another like a ceremonial cairn, surrounded by a circle of juniper trees, much older than any he had ever seen in a dream. Yúdah approached the rocks. Water trickled from beneath them, forming a small pool that reflected the sky with perfect clarity. An ancient voice spoke from the water itself. Beneath the 3-stone watch, the ancestors' gift remains. When children's hands unite, the desert drinks again. Yúdah woke with a gasp, sitting upright in the dark room. Beside him, these eyes were already open, wide and startled in the faint moonlight. 3 stones, she whispered in their shared language. "Water beneath. You dreamed it too?" he asked, astonishment replacing fear. She nodded solemnly. "My mother spoke of such a place. The old ones called it meeting water. She said it was lost when the peoples divided." Their whispers woke the grandmother, who listened intently as they described their identical dreams. Rather than dismissal, her face showed growing wonder. "The 3-stone watch," she repeated. "I know this place from the oldest stories. It was a sacred site where, in times of great drought, all peoples gathered to perform the water-bringing ceremony." She touched the dream catcher above them. "The ancestors are offering a different path. Is it real?" Yúdah asked. "Can we find it?" "It lies in the Forbidden's Valley," his grandmother replied. "A day's journey west, where the boundaries of our lands meet the territory that belongs to neither people. Few go there now. It is said to be watched by spirits. But if water is there," Tué said eagerly, "it could help both our peoples." The grandmother was silent for a long moment. The spring, if it still flows, was never ordinary water. The stories say it appeared only when the peoples came together in harmony. When the divisions grew, the water retreated beneath the earth. Yúdah fingered his juniper pendant. "The dream said, when children's hands unite. Does that mean T and me?" "Dreams speak in riddles," his grandmother answered. "But I believe nothing happens without purpose. Your meeting, her warning, now this shared vision." She looked from one child to the other. Perhaps what elders have forgotten, children must remember. Dawn was approaching. Soon the village would awake, and decisions about Tia's fate would be made. The Apache camp might already be preparing for their accelerated raid. "We must find the spring," Yúdah said with sudden conviction. "Before the raid, before anyone else is hurt. They will not let us go," Tia reminded him. The grandmother rose, her decision made. Then you must leave before they can stop you. She moved to a small chest in the corner, withdrawing an ancient piece of deerskin marked with faded symbols. This map belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It shows the old ways, the paths between peoples. She pressed it into Yúdah's hands. Find the 3-stone watch. If the ancestors have truly spoken, the spring may save us all from this drought. If not, she sighed, at least you tried what the rest of us were too afraid to attempt. Before the first roosters announced dawn, the children slipped from the village. Yúdah's grandmother had packed a small sack with cornmeal, dried fruit, and a water gourd. More importantly, she had shown them how to read the ancient map, its faded markings indicating landmarks rather than precise distances. Follow the path. Of the long-eared hare, she had instructed, pointing to a winding symbol. It leads between the territories, where fewer eyes will watch. The early morning air carried the crisp promise of heat to come. Yúdah led the way, his knowledge of the nearby land guiding their first steps. She followed, her senses alert for any sign of pursuit from either of their peoples. Will your grandmother be punished for helping us? Taj asked, as they crossed a dry stream. Yúdah considered this. She is the oldest medicine woman. Even my father respects her wisdom. He hoped this was enough protection, but doubt gnawed at him. They traveled in silence after that, moving steadily westward. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying. By midday, both children were struggling against thirst and fatigue. They rested briefly in the shadow of a sandstone, outcropping, rationing small sips of water. The map shows we must cross the wide canyon before reaching the Forbidden's Valley, Yúdah said, studying the deerskin. I've never been that far west. T.G. touched a marking near the canyon. This symbol my mother used it in her healing ceremonies. It means guardian spirit. My grandmother says the valley is watched by spirits, Yúdah remembered. Perhaps they guard the spring. The canyon proved more challenging than anticipated. Its walls, though not sheer, required careful navigation down loose scree and around prickly cactus gardens. At the bottom, they discovered the remains of an ancient trail stones laid in a purposeful line that matched a pathway marked on their map. People once traveled this way often, G observed, touching the weathered stones. Together, Yúdah added, pointing to pictographs on a nearby rock face figures of different heights and dress, walking in procession toward a central point. By late afternoon, they reached the canyon's western rim, both weary but determined. Before them stretched an unexpected sight, a valley greener than the surrounding desert, with scattered juniper and pinyon creating islands of shade. At its center, visible even from a distance, stood an unusual rock formation. 3 large boulders, balanced atop one another, exactly as in their shared dream. The 3-stone watch, Yi whispered. Her fatigue momentarily forgotten, they hurried forward with renewed energy, crossing the valley floor as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Strange rock formations dotted the landscape, not natural, but clearly shaped by human hands in times long past. Broken pottery shards, faded to the color of dust, crunched beneath their feet. The old ones lived here, Yúdah realized, recognizing patterns similar to those in the ancient Pueblo ruins near his village. When they finally reached the 3-stone watch, the sun was setting, painting the rocks with golden light. A circle of ancient junipers surrounded the formation, their twisted trunks speaking of centuries of silent witness. The children stood in the center, awed by the palpable sense of power emanating from this place. But there was no spring, no pool of water reflecting the sky, just dry earth and stone. I don't understand, T said, disappointment heavy in her voice. The dream showed water here. Yúdah circled the stone formation, searching for any sign of moisture. Maybe it's hidden. Somehow, they examined every inch of ground around the stones, finding nothing but more pottery shards, and what appeared to be a ceremonial circle made of flat rocks set into the earth. Night was approaching rapidly, bringing with it the desert's bone deep chill. We should make camp, Yúdah suggested, gathering falling branches for a small fire. Perhaps the light will be better in the morning. As darkness enveloped the valley, they huddled beside their fire, the three-stone watch looming above them like a sentinel. Despite their disappointment, neither spoke of turning back. Something about this place a feeling beyond their young. Understanding told them they were where they needed to be. My mother said water hides from the unworthy, Tiawe said softly, as they shared the last of their cornmeal. Perhaps we must prove ourselves somehow. Yúdah nodded, remembering his grandmother's similar teachings. Or perhaps, he suggested, looking up at the emerging stars, we must first listen to what this place wants to tell us. Morning brought no water, but a new perspective. As the children stirred from their sleep beside the cold ashes of the air, fire, the rising sun cast the three-stone watch in dramatic relief. Shadows stretched across the ceremonial circle, pointing like a finger toward the largest of the ancient junipers. Look, T.G. said, following the shadow's direction. The tree, it's greener than the others. They approached the gnarled juniper, its blue-green foliage indeed more vibrant than its neighbors. At its base, the ground seemed slightly darker, as though it might hold more moisture. My grandmother says to listen to the earth itself, Yúdah remembered, kneeling to press his palm against the soil. Sometimes water hides from those who haven't earned the right to find it. T joined him, both children closing their eyes to concentrate. For several minutes they remained still, sensing the subtle energy of this ancient place. A light breeze stirred the juniper branches above them, creating a whispering sound almost like voices. I think, T.G. said slowly, we need to dig. Yúdah opened his eyes, studying the ground more carefully. Here, but it's just dirt. Not just dirt, T corrected, picking up a pottery shard half buried at the tree's base. Look at the pattern. The shard bore a faded design, a spiral, surrounded by three wavy lines, the universal symbol for water among the desert peoples. As they searched the area, they found more shards with the same pattern, all concentrated around the juniper's trunk. They left a message, Yúdah realized, the ancestors. They marked this spot. With renewed hope, they began searching for digging tools. Yúdah discovered a sturdy branch fallen from one of the junipers. Using a sharp stone, he stripped away the smaller branches and sharpened one end, creating a primitive digging stick. Taking turns, they began to excavate the ground beneath the tree. The work was slow and exhausting. The soil, though slightly moister than the surrounding area, was still hard-packed from years of drought. Their hands blistered, and sweat dripped from Ziept. Their foreheads despite the morning's lingering coolness. What if we're wrong? Titch asked after an hour of labor had produced only a shallow depression. What if there's no water here at all? Yúdah paused, leaning on the digging stick. Doubt clouded his mind as well. Their water gourd was nearly empty, and without finding the spring, they would face a difficult journey home if they could even find their way back. The dream felt real, he said finally, and we both had it. That must mean something. They continued digging, their young, muscles aching with the effort. By midday, the hole was knee-deep on Yúdah, but still dry. Their enthusiasm waned with each fruitless scoop of earth. Maybe we misunderstood, T suggested, her voice tight with disappointment. Maybe the water was just a symbol for something else. Yúdah was about to agree when he remembered his grandmother's words about the water-calling chant. Wait, he said suddenly. We haven't tried everything yet. He sat on the edge of the hole and began to sing the ancient melody his grandmother had taught him, the one she had insisted would be important someday. His young voice carried across the valley, the unfamiliar words feeling right in this sacred place. Zi's eyes widened in recognition. My mother knew this song, she whispered. After listening for a moment, she joined him, adding her voice to his. Their different accents merged into something new yet ancient, the harmony creating a sound neither had heard before. As the final notes faded, they looked at each other with a mixture of hope and resignation. Nothing had changed. Hull remained dry. One more try, Yúdah said, picking up the digging stick. Deeper. He struck the ground at the center of their excavation with all his remaining strength. The stick plunged deeper than expected, suddenly breaking through into emptiness. Yúdah lost his balance, tumbling forward as loose dirt cascaded into a hidden cavity. Yúdah, too, cried, pulling him back from the edge. They stared in astonishment as the bottom of their hole transformed. Dark moisture seeped upward, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. A small puddle formed, then expanded. Within minutes, clear water was bubbling up from beneath the earth, filling their excavation with liquid that caught the sunlight like polished silver. The water rose until it formed a pool about 2 feet deep, its surface perfectly still except where it continued to bubble up from below. The children stared in silent wonder, almost afraid to move lest the miracle vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. Finally, Tej yacked to her knees beside the spring. "May I?" she asked, her hands hovering above the water. Yúdah nodded. They both felt the need for ceremony, for acknowledgement of what they had discovered. They dipped her fingers into the pool and touched them to her forehead, then her heart, murmuring words in her own language. Yúdah recognized it as a blessing, similar to what his grandmother performed when harvesting special plants. He joined her, adding the Pueblo water greeting, a simple gesture of cupped hands, lifting water toward the sky before letting it fall, back to its source. Together, they created a new ritual, combining elements from both their traditions. The water tasted unlike any they had ever known, sweet and mineral-rich, with a clarity that seemed to refresh more deeply than ordinary water. They filled their gourd and drank directly from the spring, their thirst finally quenched after the long journey and exhausting dig. "The ancestors' gift," Yúdah said, remembering the words from their dream. "It could save both our peoples," Jian added, her eyes bright with excitement. No more raids, no more fighting over dried-up waterholes. The reality of their situation gradually reasserted itself. They had found the spring, yes, but they were still 2 children alone in the Forbidden's Valley. Their people were still preparing for conflict, unaware of this discovery. "We need to tell them," Yúdah said, gesturing in the direction of both their homes. "Done. But how? We can't bring everyone here ourselves." They considered the problem as they rested beside the spring, watching as its overflow began to create a small stream that wound away toward a patch of wildflowers they hadn't noticed before. "We could each return to our own village," Yúdah suggested. "Bring our families back here. Would they believe us? Without proof?" Yúdah thought of his father's skepticism, the council's mistrust. "Maybe not just our words," he admitted. They searched among the pottery shards, finding 2 that fit together to create a small bowl-like vessel. Using clay from the spring's edge, they sealed the pieces together, creating a water carrier more ceremonial than practical. "I will take this to my uncle," T said, carefully filling the makeshift vessel. "The water itself will speak of its power." Yúdah nodded, filling their gourd for his own return journey. "We should mark the path clearly so we can find our way back." They spent the remainder of the day preparing for their separate journeys. Using stones and fallen branches, they created markers that would guide them back to the spring. They gathered as much food as they could find: pinyon nuts from the trees, early berries from bushes that grew in the spring's path, even edible roots that TG recognized as sunset approached. They faced the difficult moment of parting. 2 days, Yúdah said. "We meet back here with our people in 2 days." Tai nodded, though her eyes betrayed concern. What if they won't come? What if they don't believe? And we bring those who will listen, even if it's just a few at first. He touched his juniper pendant. My grandmother will believe. She knows the old stories. My cousin Nita will come if I ask, Tia said. And some of the older women who remember my mother's teachings. They stood awkwardly for a moment, their friendship now complicated by the weight of their discovery and the responsibility it placed upon them. Be careful, Yúdah said finally. A path to your camp crosses rocky ground. Watch for snakes near the canyon edge, Tia replied. They sun themselves on the western rocks. Without further words, they embraced briefly, an unprecedented gesture between Apache and Pueblo children. Then they separated, each carrying water from the sacred spring, each heading toward their respective homes. Neither could know what awaited them. Yúdah's village would be in turmoil, preparing defenses against the feared Apache raid. Tia's camp would be mobilizing, their raid plans accelerated by her disappearance. Both children carried not just water, but hope a fragile solution that might either unite their peoples or arrive too late to prevent bloodshed. Yúdah reached his village first, the familiar adobe walls coming into view as the sun began its descent on the second day of his journey. He had traveled quickly, sleeping little, driven by the urgency of his mission. The water gourd bounced against his hip with each step, its contents still miraculously cool despite the desert heat. He expected to find the village in its normal rhythm of evening activities. Instead, he encountered a community preparing for war. Men sharpened hunting spears into weapons along the central plaza. Women packed travel food in filled water containers. Children were being gathered into the innermost rooms for protection. No one noticed Yúdah's arrival at first, so focused were they on their preparations. His father spotted him from across the plaza and strode toward him, his face a storm of relief and fury. "Where have you been?" he demanded, gripping Yúdah's shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Your grandmother refused to tell us where you'd gone. Is she all right?" Yúdah asked, suddenly fearful for the old woman. "She sits in silence, speaking to no one." His father's voice softened slightly. "She said we would understand when you returned." Looking around at the war preparations, Yúdah's heart sank. "The Apache haven't raided yet?" "No, but scouts spotted. They're warriors moving south. They will come tonight or tomorrow." His father studied him more carefully. "Where is the Apache girl? Did she lead you into a trap?" "No. Tu went to her people to stop the raid." Yúdah held up the water gourd. "Father, we found something important. Something that could end the fighting forever." His father's skepticism was evident, but he allowed Yúdah to be brought before the village council, which had been in continuous session since the warning of the impending raid. The elders sat in a semicircle, the ceremonial talking stick passing from hand to hand as each spoke their counsel. Yúdah's grandmother sat slightly apart, her face impassive, but her eyes lighting with recognition when she saw the water gourd in his hands. "The boy has returned," announced the head elder, an ancient man named Kokopelli. "Let him speak." With all eyes upon him, Yúdah found his voice shaking. "The Apache raid can be stopped. There's another way." He held up the gourd. "Tea. And I found the sacred spring from the oldest stories. The 3-stone watch in the Forbidden's Valley. It has water enough for all our peoples." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the council. One elder snorted openly. "Children's fantasies won't stop Apache arrows." "It's not fantasy," Yúdah insisted. "Grandmother, tell them about the spring, about the old days when our peoples shared water." All eyes turned to the old woman, who nodded slowly. "The stories speak of such a place, a spring that appears only when the peoples come together in harmony." "Harmony?" scoffed another elder. "With those who steal our corn and threaten our children?" Yúdah uncapped the gourd. "Taste the water. It's like nothing you've ever known." Reluctantly, the head elder accepted the gourd and took a small sip. His eyes widened slightly before he passed it to the next council member. As the vessel made its way around the circle, the expressions changed from skepticism to wonder. "This water," the head elder admitted, "has a quality I haven't tasted since my youth." "The spring is real," Yúdah pressed, "and it can provide water for both our peoples. T.G. has gone to convince her uncle to come to the Three-Stone Watch instead of raiding. We agreed to meet there in 2 days." "A trap," someone suggested. "No," Yúdah's grandmother spoke firmly. "The children have been guided by the ancestors. This is the way forward if we have the courage to take it." The council erupted into argument, some advocating for trust in the ancient ways, others insisting that defense was the only rational response to Apache aggression. The division was clear in their faces, in the white-knuckled grip with which they held the talking stick dot. As the debate raged, a scout burst into the kiva. Apache approaching from the east. At least 20 warriors, moving fast. The council fell silent. The moment of decision had arrived. "We must meet them with strength," Yúdah's father insisted. "Or," the grandmother suggested, her voice cutting, "through the tension, we could meet them with water." T.G.'s journey had been no less urgent and far more complicated. She had reached her camp to find it nearly deserted, with only the very old and very young remaining behind. The warriors, including her uncle, had already departed for the raid. Her cousin Netta had embraced her with tears of relief. "They thought the Pueblo people took you. Uncle used it as reason to attack sooner. I must follow them," T had insisted, showing her cousin the special water. "This can stop the fighting." An ancient grandmother, too frail to move when the camp relocated for raids, had recognized the water's significance immediately. "From the sacred spring," she'd whispered. "I thought it was only a story." With her help, T had convinced several women and older children to accompany her toward the Pueblo village, hoping to intercept the warriors before blood was shed. Now, as dawn broke on what would have been the meeting day at the spring, 2 unlikely groups converged on the village outskirts. The Apache warriors, led by T's uncle, approached from the east with weapons ready. From the village emerged not an armed defense force, but a procession led by Yúdah's grandmother, carrying vessels of water. Yúdah walked beside her, his heart pounding with fear and hope. Between these groups stood Tu and her small band of women and children, forming a human barrier. When her uncle spotted her, his face transformed from war readiness to astonishment. "T, stand aside," he commanded. "No, uncle," she replied, her young voice steady. "There is another way." She held up her pottery vessel. "We found the ancestors' water. The sacred spring has returned." Confusion rippled through the Apache warriors. Behind them, the women who had followed Tay began singing a traditional healing song, its melody carrying across the tense space between the groups. From the Pueblo side, Yúdah's grandmother stepped forward, her aged face bearing no fear. As she approached the Apache leader, to everyone's astonishment, she spoke in the ancient language that predated their people's division. "Water Seeker," she addressed the Apache leader, using a ceremonial title rather than his name. "Our children have found what we lost generations ago." T.G.'s uncle hesitated, the spear in his hand lowering slightly. "Soft-spoken wisdom?" he replied in the same ancient tone. "You still live?" The 2 elders stared at each other across decades of separation. Recognition dawned on both weathered faces. "We were friends once," Yúdah's grandmother said for all to hear. "Before the Great Division. I was Naujug then." "And I was Tolto," the Apache leader responded, ancient. Names unused for nearly 60 years. A murmur passed through both groups. Few had known that their respected elders shared a history. Fewer still had heard them use their childhood names. Yúdah and Tui exchanged glances of amazement. Even they hadn't known their guardians were connected. The children found the 3-stone watch, Yúdah's grandmother continued. The spring flows again. She offered her water vessel to T's uncle. Taste what your niece brought from the sacred place. With ceremonial dignity, he accepted the vessel and drank. His eyes widened, then softened with recognition. The water of my grandfather's stories, he acknowledged. I thought it lost forever. It was, she agreed. Until the children rediscovered it. Perhaps they see with clearer eyes than we do. The tension slowly ebbed as water vessels were shared between the groups. Warriors lowered their weapons. Villagers emerged from hiding. Curious murmurs replaced hostile silence. There is enough for all, Yúdah announced, his voice gaining strength as he saw the change in both groups. The spring fills a pool that never empties. We can take you there. But first, 2G added, we must agree to share it. As our ancestors did. An elderly Apache woman pushed forward through the crowd. Using a walking stick for support, she approached the space between the groups, where an ancient peace pipe had been discovered near the spring, tucked into Yúdah's grandmother's sash. I have not seen this pipe since I was younger than these children, she announced, running her fingers over its carved surface. It was used in the water-sharing ceremony, when all peoples gathered at the spring during drought times. You remember the ceremony? TG's uncle asked. The old woman nodded. I was the last water-keeper's apprentice, before the fighting began. By midday, an unprecedented gathering had formed at the 3-stone watch. The journey there had been tense but peaceful, with Yúdah and Tiaju leading the way. Their small forms darting ahead like hummingbirds guiding larger, more cautious birds. The spring welcomed them with its gentle bubbling, now flowing more strongly than when the children had first discovered it. The stream it created had already carved a delicate path downhill, nurturing desert plants along its course. The Apache and Pueblo groups maintained a respectful distance from each other, camping on opposite sides of the spring, but the children moved freely between them, as did the oldest members of both communities, who seemed to remember a time before such rigid separation. Yúdah's grandmother and T's uncle sat together near the largest of the ancient junipers, speaking quietly, in the old language. Occasionally, one would laugh softly, and the other would nod in recognition of some shared memory. They were childhood friends, the elderly Apache woman explained to the children as they brought her water. Before the great sickness came and the waters dried up, before blame turned to hatred. What happened? PG asked, settling beside her. The same as now. Drought, hunger, fear. The old woman sighed. When there is not enough, people forget how to share. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Yúdah's father approached the spring. He had been among the most skeptical, keeping his distance and watching the Apache warriors with undisguised suspicion. Now he knelt and cupped his hands, drinking directly from the source. This water, he said, looking up at his son with newfound respect, it tastes like the stories my grandmother told. Water that heals more than thirst. That is its purpose, said Tu's uncle, joining them. Our grandfathers knew this? Somehow we forgot. The two men regarded each other warily, decades of mistrust not easily set aside. But the spring between them offered common ground. My son risked much to find this place, Yúdah's father said finally. As did my niece, the Apache leader acknowledged. Perhaps they are wiser than we have been. By evening, elders from both peoples had begun discussing practical matters, how to protect the spring, how to ensure fair access, how to transport water to those who could not make the journey. Clay tablets were brought out, and both Apache and Pueblo record keepers began documenting the emerging agreement. Yúdah watched in amazement as his father contributed to these discussions, offering suggestions about irrigation techniques that could extend the spring's reach. TG's uncle proposed hunting boundaries that would allow both peoples access to game without conflict. It is like the oldest stories. Yúdah's grandmother told the gathering as they shared an evening meal, the first communal feast between their peoples in living memory. The spring appears when we come together. It flows when we remember our shared humanity. But will it remain? Someone asked, or disappear again when we separate? The elderly Apache woman who remembered the water ceremony spoke up. The stories say the spring stays as long as the water treaty is honored, as long as all who drink from it remember that it belongs to no one and everyone. Throughout the night, more people arrived from both communities. Those who had been skeptical but curious, those who had been left behind to guard homes, those who had heard rumors of peace after generations of conflict. By dawn, the valley held the largest gathering of Apache and Pueblo peoples in memory. The children who had made it possible sat together on a rock overlooking the growing encampment, their friendship no longer a dangerous secret, but a symbol of new possibilities. They're already talking about building a permanent settlement here. Yúdah told Tuji, his voice filled with wonder. Not just Pueblo, not just Apache, but both. And others, Tuhi added. I heard your grandmother say messengers should be sent to all peoples affected by the drought. The formal water treaty ceremony began as the sun reached its zenith. Using traditions from both cultures and guided by the elders who remembered the old ways, they created something new yet anchored in ancient wisdom. Clay tablets recorded the agreement in both languages. Water was shared in specially crafted vessels. Songs from both peoples twined together in the clear desert air, creating harmonies unheard for generations. Seasons turned like pottery on a wheel, reshaping the land around the three-stone watch. What began as a temporary gathering grew into something permanent and unprecedented. Settlement neither wholly Pueblo nor entirely Apache, but something new born from both traditions. Stone and adobe structures rose in a circle around the spring, their designs reflecting both peoples' architectural wisdom. Gardens flourished where the stream's path had been thoughtfully directed. Grapevines and fruit trees, once impossible in this harsh landscape, took root and thrived in the microclimate created by the sacred water dot at the center of it all. The spring continued to flow, never diminishing despite the growing community it supported. If anything, it seemed to strengthen as the settlement expanded, as if responding to the harmony that now prevailed where division had once ruled. 3 years had passed since that first discovery. Yúdah, now 10 summers old, stood taller and leaner, his juniper pendant still hanging faithfully around his neck. T, nearly 12, had grown into her name's contradiction far from withering. She blossomed with vibrant health and purpose. They stood together at dawn beside the spring, performing the daily water blessing that had become their special responsibility. Neither wore the distinct clothing of their original peoples anymore. Like most of the children in the settlement, they dressed in a new style that borrowed elements from both traditions. Remember when we first found this place? Yúdah asked, watching the morning light play across the water's surface. You were certain we'd dig straight through to the spirit world, Tiek teased. Your eyes were as big as cooking pots when the water first appeared. Yours weren't much smaller, he countered with a grin. Their easy friendship had become the heart of the community, a living reminder of how the settlement began. Children from both backgrounds now played together without thought of division, learning both languages, both sets of stories. The elders watched this integration with varying degrees of wonder and occasional concern. Some traditions were worth preserving separately, they insisted. Others naturally merged into new forms that honored both origins. Yúdah's grandmother, now moved permanently to the settlement, had established a healing center that combined Apache and Pueblo medicine. Tiji spent most afternoons there, her natural talent for healing strengthened by formal training in both traditions. The messengers returned from the northern tribes. Pei Vai mentioned as they completed the blessing. 3 more families will join us before the first snow." Word of the settlement had spread across the territories. Other peoples suffering from the drought had sent representatives to learn about the spring and the unprecedented cooperation it had inspired. Some stayed, others returned home with new ideas about water conservation and conflict resolution. Yúdah's father, once among the most skeptical, had become an advocate for the settlement's approach. He now led expeditions to other drought-affected communities, teaching irrigation techniques developed at the spring. "Father says we'll need to build at least 5 more dwellings before winter," Yúdah said. "The council is meeting today to plan." The council itself represented the settlement's unique character-equal numbers from both peoples. Decisions made by consensus rather than authority, with even the children given voice in matters that affected them not as the sun climbed higher. The settlement stirred to life around them. Morning cooking fires sent fragrant smoke spiraling into the clear air. Children's laughter echoed between the dwellings. Somewhere, a grandmother began singing a working song, soon joined by voices from both traditions. At the edge of the spring, Yúdah and Tingji had planted 2 saplings on the first anniversary. Of their discovery, 1 pine favored by the Apache, 1 cottonwood sacred to the Pueblo. The trees had grown surprisingly quickly, their branches now beginning to intertwine above the water. "My uncle says even the old conflicts to the south are quieting," Tian said. "Other peoples are finding their own ways to share what remains of their water." "Perhaps our spring isn't the only one waiting to be found," Yúdah suggested. "Perhaps there are many sacred places just waiting for people to remember how to see them." They joined hands briefly, a gesture that had evolved from their childish friendship pledge into something deeper, a connection that, like the settlement itself, pointed toward possibilities neither of their peoples had imagined before. The water continued to bubble up from deep within the earth, clear and sweet and unending, a promise kept by the ancestors to children, brave enough to believe in a world beyond boundaries.